Bitspiration flew me in from San Francisco to answer all of your questions on startup ecosystems. And I hope you'll take advantage of that today. During my presentation, feel free to raise your hand and to ask questions. I'm going to give you some insights based on some research that we did and based on our own personal experience. But it's always the best if I can get questions from people here and I can answer them and address your specific concerns. Who of you here is interested in making Krakow the #1 ecosystem in Poland? A few people. I can see like 5, 6 people. What is everyone else interested in? Huh? So different cities. So who is here from Krakow and who's from Krakow? Okay, a few more. So some people from Krakow don't care about making Krakow an ecosystem. And then who's not from Krakow? All right, the majority. That's great. That's great. Is anyone from outside of Poland here? Also quite a bit. That's great. That's good. That's always a good sign for any ecosystem when you start to have people coming from all around the world. And I think that's Bitspiration has been doing a great job in actually getting a lot of people from around the world all together to this conference. If in San Francisco I would ask this question, and that's where my company is located, you would have the vast majority of people raising their hand, since most of the people in the valley are from abroad or from other places within the US. Almost more than half of all the startups founded in San Francisco are founded by immigrants. So in some ways, Silicon Valley is really still today this mecca of entrepreneurship where everyone comes and sort of builds their company. And up until a few years back, Silicon Valley and a few other places seem to be sort of the only option of building your specifically technology company, and that has changed significantly over the last years. We've seen an enormous rise of ecosystems, and Krakow might be one of them, and that's really exciting. So I'm going to talk about this today. Here's sort of a quick agenda. I can go through this really quickly, so we'll have time for questions. So feel free to raise your hand and with me. All right. So first, I'm going to give a quick introduction about my own work and so what qualifies me to even give any kind of advice or input on ecosystems. Then I'll talk quickly sort of about the different players within an ecosystem and sort of their respective pain points and why and how I believe that ecosystems, specifically startup ecosystems, matter, and why all of you who are here from Krakow should have a vested interest in making Krakow a better ecosystem. And then, the role of sort of ecosystems, like how they differ, giving sort of some systems and structure to help you to better understand what an ecosystem actually is. And then we'll talk about the different companies and how they've been able to leverage one or more ecosystems. All right, quickly. So I started back in 2010, after my last startup. I was very much inspired by seeing all these startups popping out all over the world. And we started a research on startups, understanding how startups evolve, what's the life cycle, why do they fail, what makes them successful, together with Stanford and later on also Berkeley and Oxford researchers joined this research, and we published a number of reports on startups that have been downloaded more than 50,000 times. We have a lot of universities now that have actually taken those reports into their curriculum to teach entrepreneurship. And based on this research that we did, we created a tool called Compass that all of you can check out at compass.com, which is essentially an automated sort of mentor, right? After seeing that there's a lot of mentors that sort of give the same advice over and over again, we thought maybe there's a more scalable way of helping startups around the world. So we created this tool where essentially you share a bunch of information about your company with us, and we provide you with an automated feedback and benchmarks and recommendations on your company. Most interesting is probably the very specific reference point on your metrics. So today it's very difficult for you to see whether you're actually taking off, whether you're actually moving in the right direction as a company or not, whether you reach product market fit or not, whether you should focus on decreasing your customer acquisition cost or whether you should focus on growth, whether you should fix your retention or your churn or your activation. All of these different data that you're collecting today about your company, or at least you should be collecting, are very difficult to evaluate without having the right reference points. So we provide those, and then we also add in some recommendations and different predictions, and we're working on allowing you to do simulations where you can actually sort of test different scenarios for your business. So that's what we do, and based on this product, we're doing a lot of research, and we create new reports that we hope can help entrepreneurs or business owners around the world to be more successful. Now, for looking at an ecosystem, you have a lot of different players, and all of these different players have very different interests, right? So who here in the audience is an entrepreneur? Who's founded a startup? All right, like a few, maybe 15%. Who is an investor? Okay, even less, some. Who is interested to work for a startup? Even less. Should be more hands. Who is a service provider or in corporate development or in some other way sort of interested in startups? Another few. So who are all the other people? Who is just generally interested in entrepreneurship? No? All right. Well, I can't go through the rows now, but I would love to hear why you're here. Anyway, so there is different players. The main one, of course, being the entrepreneur who sort of makes the ecosystem thrive, but there's also other people, investors, the talent that works at those different companies. You have service providers, recruiters, lawyers, etc., corporate development. Then you have policymakers that also do their part in trying to help an ecosystem to thrive. For entrepreneurs, ecosystems are relevant because they have to decide where they start their company. They have to decide where they expand their company. So for a lot of people who are here and who are founders, some of you might have already started a company, and so the question is, are you going to stay in Poland? Are you going to build a second office in Germany or in the UK or maybe in the US? And that is a very important question. As I heard talking to a number of entrepreneurs here, it's easy to sort of raise the first money, but then it becomes very difficult to raise the second round because there's no sort of a funding gap that is present here. So for all of you, it becomes very important to actually make a decision of where are you going to go next, right? Where are you going to get or move maybe part of the team in order to be able to expand your company global and to be able to raise additional money. For investors, there's today investors usually invest into companies that are sort of in their proximity, and the reason why is because most of the time they invest based on recommendations, based on references they get from their friends. So it's very sort of close networks where there's no real other proxy of quality than recommendations, which is why for any of you who's moving into another ecosystem to expand their company, it actually takes some time until you get to know people that will recommend you to other investors. So it's not very easy to just, you can't just go to another ecosystem to raise money there. It takes time. And for investors, they're somewhat caught within their own circles. And we actually, did a bigger study on ecosystems a bit ago. And some of the questions we tried to answer are those questions for investors to try to give them more transparency globally in how they can diversify their portfolio and other opportunities. And really what we see as a result of our report, we got a lot of feedback from especially bigger VC firms that are very actively starting to invest across the world in ecosystems that today are sort of undercovered or where there's very specific funding gaps. Poland or Warsaw or Krakow maybe being one of them in the future. Policymakers are today somehow lost, right? Most policymakers you talk to, they don't have a background in entrepreneurship. They have no idea what's fucking going on in the startup world. And so many times you have a lot of initiatives that are really, they can be more counterproductive than actually supportive to an ecosystem. And they came to us asking questions saying, how can we specifically help ecosystems to grow, and how can we measure the result of that? Then you have Corp Dev, they're also an important part of an ecosystem because they many times acquiring the companies, and that's sort of the end of a circle that is important because it's adding sort of new angel money, seed money into the ecosystem where successful founders start investing into that sort of next upcoming startups. And then you have talent and other service providers that wonder, where should I go to get the best opportunity in my career. Right now there's lots of great talent in Poland, which is fairly low cost. Which is great for entrepreneurs, but talent really has the opportunity to, for example, move to San Francisco and to earn 3, 4, 5 times as much and be in an ecosystem where they can take away a lot more for themselves. Now, why is all of this important? As I said, there's this enormous explosion of entrepreneurship globally. We've seen that in places that we would never expect, we've seen startups popping out of the ground. It's sort of this global movement. And some people look at this and say, oh, this might be just another bubble and it's going to be over soon. I don't think so. It's actually really important what is happening here right now. It's really important, that this conference is happening sort of as a spark of really helping this ecosystem to grow, because what we see is that a lot of these high growth companies have become very important for our economy. In the US, we see that almost the entire job growth comes from those highly scalable companies, most of them being high growth software companies. We see that almost the entire economic rejuvenation in the United States comes from those high growth technology companies. And that's pretty enormous. That's something that was for a lot of people was an epiphany, because everyone kind of thought of the large companies, or sometimes the small, medium-sized business is really driving the economy in the US, which turns out not to be true. And taking this a bit further, what we see really right now happening is something that Deloitte, the Edge Center and Deloitte calls the big shift. So there's a socioeconomic structural shift where, and that's my personal prediction, so there's no data behind this, but I believe over the next 15 to 20 years what we will see is that half of what today is service industry is going to be replaced by software, which means that half of the part of the economy where the majority of value generation is happening is going to be replaced by software, which means that people who are accountants, who are doctors, who are consultants, who are personal trainers, all these people that do some kind of repeatable task that might be complex and that might require some kind of education, but that is a systemized task, will be eventually either replaced by software, or some individuals will be amplified to a degree where a lot of other people might sort of lose their job. So in some ways, even though software companies will be driving a lot of that, a lot of new economic growth, a lot of new job growth, they will also destroy a lot of jobs. And all the people that today are going to university thinking that they might, for the rest of their life, work as an accountant, might actually end up not doing that because their job might not be existent anymore in the future, or might be reduced to something much less attractive. And the reason why this is happening is because there were certain breakthroughs in technology in the past years, especially. There's one particular type of company that I call data refineries that are really driving this, where essentially, for the first time, you have a massive access on data, and that is growing continuously. You have had certain breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and ability to process those data to then create a higher value output out of those low value data. That's important because what you can start doing with that is that you essentially have the food in order to make an artificial intelligence work. And you can build diagnostic devices that replace some of the work that is being done by doctors today. There's a number of those companies coming up already. There's actually a friend of mine, together with one of the Skype founders, they're working on something specifically in that space. There's you can see this in a law. So there's a lot of specific legal products where, based on certain data input, you can create legal documents. You will see the same thing in business, and really our company actually also fits into that construct. So what we're doing is we, with Compass, are really replacing the kind of work that is being done today for larger companies, because it is very expensive, because it's done manually by McKinsey or BCG and all of these companies. We're automating that same work, and we can do it instantly for almost no cost, where day-to-day, sometimes you have to pay millions in order to get that kind of service from them. And summarizing that, this is why your work as entrepreneurs or investors is actually really important, and your work in helping to make the Krakow ecosystem grow is very important for the coming decades, for the next generation of people who will be living here, because that's the fundament of the future economy. And all the companies that are being built today will help that economy. Now, any questions so far? Does it all make sense? Yeah? So what is an ecosystem actually, right? I kind of simplified it very much just for people to kind of understand, what's the process of an ecosystem. In the end of the day, what an ecosystem does and what it's centered around is around talent, inspiring that talent and giving that talent the perspective of starting new companies or joining companies, and then providing that talent with the right resources in order to build companies, and then retaining that talent to stay within that ecosystem. And it's pretty simple. And as an ecosystem builder, you can step into those different points, and you can of course differentiate them out much more. But you can help to bring more talent into an ecosystem. You can help to give that ecosystem, or to give people within that ecosystem, the perspective of even choosing entrepreneurship as a path, or startups as a path. I talked with some Polish entrepreneurs before this talk, and many people said one of the problems is that a lot of people here just don't see entrepreneurship as a possible career path, and they're kind of missing the perspective of that it's possible for them to do this That really is that is an important function within an ecosystem, that this is done in some ways through those kind of conferences, through older entrepreneurs going to universities and kind of educating the next generation and so on. And then the next point, of course, is much more complex, but I'm sure you get what I mean with that. And then the last one is actually pretty important, because what you can see with a lot of ecosystems that are older is that sometimes they will actually start to sort of fall apart, and you see some kind of brain drain happening. Of course, everyone will deny this about the ecosystem, but you see this in the US, for example, with like Boston, specifically for the software space. A lot of people went from Boston to New York or San Francisco, Seattle. You had similar kind of effects. That brain drain can be harmful. So it actually is difficult to retain good people within an ecosystem if they are not happy. This is sort of a very a life cycle of like how an ecosystem evolves, right? Where I think it's very important to understand that ecosystems, just like a company or like anything else, goes through different steps as it's evolving. And you can see that many times it starts off with sort of the first few startups coming together within a very concentrated area. At some point, they go through something that we call like a hype cycle. We've seen Berlin going through that, where certain ecosystems get really overhyped, but that helps to attract a lot of talent. It helps to get investors into the ecosystem, to activate investors to start investing. At some point, the ecosystem becomes self-sustaining, where it has enough investors, enough talent, enough service providers in order to actually function properly. And then, as it gains independence, starts to usually integrate with first the local economy, and then at some point, with global economy. It's almost like a consolidation that happened. Berlin is probably the closest example to where over the last 5 years we've seen this, that Berlin 5 years ago wasn't considered to be the #1 ecosystem, right? There was Munich, there was Hamburg, a bunch of different German cities where people were running their startups. And only recently, as they sort of have been hyped a lot, they were able to really consolidate all the talent, all the companies from in Germany to Berlin, but also from within the European ecosystem. And then as they also expand globally, they go through something we call sustained expansion for global integration and sort of continuous growth. That's sort of where Silicon Valley is, for example. Then you have ossified expansion, so it's usually ecosystems that kind of can't really renew themselves. It's a little bit where Tel Aviv is, which was a great ecosystem and has grown a lot and has put out a lot of great companies, but sort of at a point right now where it really needs to sort of get back into the game and start to renew themselves a little bit in terms of talent, technology, so on. And then you have 6, which is contraction, so where essentially ecosystem sort of slowly starts to fall apart. And you can see this many times with ecosystems that have great infrastructure, lots of investors, but there's no entrepreneurs because they all left. Yeah.
What do you mean by local and global consolidation?
Consolidation is essentially that initially, so that's the example that I gave with Germany, right? So in the beginning, you had startups in Stuttgart, in Hamburg, in Munich, in I forgot, Düsseldorf. So, you had like maybe 10 different cities where there were startups, right? And there was no particular reason why people would be going. Cologne was another one. Why people would be going to Berlin. And Berlin has been like very aggressive in sort of positioning itself as the place where German entrepreneurs at least should be going, and that has led to most of those companies moving to Berlin. That's what we call like a consolidation. Does it make sense?
And Berlin, it makes sense, obviously. And Berlin became this phase of integration followed by independence, in your opinion. So Berlin first became a sustainable ecosystem, and then it started to attract, or it was the other way around.
Yeah, I mean there's somewhat of an oscillation, right, that happens where it's kind of like a mix between like hype where a lot of things yeah, okay, good. All right, so this is one of those slides with a lot of text. I'm going to go through this quickly as the time's actually running faster than I thought. So what we did with our research, and you can read through the ecosystem report later, you can download it on our website. We started looking at sort of different components of what makes an ecosystem run, and that starts off with just, of course, the general output, like how many companies does an ecosystem create, what's the funding infrastructure like, what's the performance of individual companies, how's the mindset, how risk-taking are entrepreneurs and companies in those different ecosystems, then how the Trendsetter Index looks at what type of technologies companies are using, what kind of processes they're using, and what type of business models they're using, and kind of looks at how much at the edge are they. Then support index looks at, of course, like mentors, service providers, support infrastructure, and then talent. And differentiation index really looks at how much an ecosystem can differentiate itself from the valley. And the reason why we found that this is pretty important actually is that even though the valley kind of, or Silicon Valley shows, it gives some examples of how you can successfully build an ecosystem. Still, in the end of the day, there's some things that you can copy, but some things for some things, an ecosystem needs to find its own way. And we kind of differentiate that as of two pieces. One is the developmental way of how an ecosystem evolves, and that sort of is essentially those 6 stages. And then we have sort of an evolutionary part, which is kind of a random piece where New York is much stronger than the Valley in fashion or in finance, just because they have established industries in those areas, and therefore they have built out great companies in those areas. Here is the ranking. It's also pretty small, but I think you should be able to see it properly. So this is the ranking that we've done in the report, and this just covers the top 20. And Warsaw is in the top 40. Krakow is unfortunately not there yet. I hope next year it will be there. And what you can see is that really, there is the top ecosystem, as expected, was the Valley. Somewhat surprising. Second one is Tel Aviv, which is yeah.
Can I have a question?
Yeah, go.
You said Warsaw was in the top 20 and Krakow was
Top 40.
Top 40, and
Yeah.
Krakow didn't make it even into the top 40. What was the actual logic behind the valuation of those two cities? Because in Krakow there are probably more startups, more IT companies, more investors, and more events, and so on and so on. So, how did Warsaw get ahead? Sorry for everyone if you're from Warsaw.
Well, so essentially, really, to be honest, if you look at most ecosystems that are after the top 20, or even maybe after the top 10, you're looking at like a long tail, right? Where there's like few ecosystems that are just like massively like more advanced than all the other ecosystems, and then the rest they're all pretty much the same compared to the top ecosystems. And Wausau's in the top 40, but the differences are minuscule. So the differences are really tiny compared to top ecosystems.
And is the difference between the the top 40 and the top 20 huge or still small?
Yeah, so there's very big differences. However, those differences were much bigger only a few years ago. So one of the very exciting things to see is that actually over the last few years you've seen this emergence of ecosystems around the world, right? Something that hasn't happened before, where suddenly you can build a great company in Moscow or in Paris, and you have all the ingredients as necessary in order to start your company there. And you actually start to see a lot of activity, right? That wasn't the case a few years ago. So, and that's really exciting. And anyways, so we have another 10 minutes. I'm going to go through a few of, a little bit through the ranking here, and then talk about some examples, and we can do some questions. So, Valley is on top. What you can see, for example, with Tel Aviv is that they, have a great, have a lot of companies. They do have, and by the way, the output index is adjusted to population density. So otherwise, specifically for the output, New York would be second, but considering population density, Tel Aviv is higher. So what we can see is that the performance of companies in Tel Aviv is not as good, and that's sort of one area where they are significantly worse. And the reason there is actually something that might also be very similar to one problem that you have in Krakow or in the Polish ecosystem, is that there is companies, and the Israeli market is much smaller than the Polish market, but there is actually a fair amount of companies that focus on the Israeli market. And the returns, of course, are tiny, and the possible growth is very little. It's somewhat, in Israel it's somewhat split, so you have like half the companies that go global on day one because the market is just so tiny that it doesn't even make sense to want to build a large company in this local market. But there's still a fair amount of companies that tackle the local market. Many times the reason why they do this, when we did interviews, what people would say is like, we first want to sort of prove our concept in the local market. What happens is that most people, get stuck within the local market and kind of start to adjust to some kind of specifics that are very particular to that local market, but that aren't relevant for a global market. And that is a trap that a lot of companies run into. And I'm sure you've seen the same in Poland. And going global from day one is something very difficult, but it's certainly something you should do if you want to build a global company, or if you want to build the next Facebook or the next Google. That's something that you need to do. And then also, one interesting thing here is the Trendsetter Index, where you can see that Tel Aviv, which was really strong in the past, is kind of stuck still with a lot of very old technologies. There's still a lot of industries that haven't been very innovative. Recently, they've been sort of very much in the B2B, like in the security space, that has been moving very slowly, and therefore they many times have a hard time to adopt to new trends coming up. You've seen that over the last few years with the whole social media wave, Tel Aviv really had a hard time to sort of be on top of this. Now, interesting is that Los Angeles is also fairly high up there, and here, like if you're a Polish startup and you're thinking about going into or expanding into another ecosystem, this list might be helpful to you to make this decision. Where there's of course sort of specific sort of particularities to each ecosystem, right? Los Angeles is a great place if you're doing anything in media, if you're doing anything that requires partnerships with global media companies. Los Angeles or also New York are a much better place to get started than Silicon Valley. If you're doing anything in security, Tel Aviv might actually be a very good place for you to start your company or to expand your company too. London is great finance, fashion is great in New York, e-commerce. So all of these places, even though they're not ranked as high as Silicon Valley, they do have their sort of pros and cons that can help or that make them special in some way. You can also see some impacts, for example, maybe as a quick so from an investor perspective, one of the things that we've seen is that a lot of investors are actually starting to look for a lot of global deals to start sourcing in a lot of ecosystems where they can find companies that are undervalued or undervalued maybe compared to Silicon Valley valuations. The terms for a company are very high in the Valley for seed round. You might easily be at the $4 to $6 million cap for what some YC companies. You go beyond 10 million for the seed round, you just need to go to Los Angeles and you already have a much lower cap on that. And then you have a lot of great companies, for example in Sydney, that are also pretty global because they're an English-speaking nation, the valuations are much lower. You have great talent there. So, Greylock, for example, has been sourcing a lot of deals out of Sydney. You've seen a number of VC firms that started going to Moscow, Berlin, and other places to try to find good deals there. For policymakers, what is interesting is that, for example, Santiago has made it on this list, right? And Santiago has been essentially non-existent not many years ago, and today it is on this list. And interestingly, they have made it on the list with very little resources, but with very focused and effective, a very focused and effective campaign called Startup Chile, where they essentially build sort of a base community by getting a lot of international entrepreneurs to Santiago to start building their companies, to start building out their technical teams, not forcing them to stay there forever, but to come over for a few months and to be there. And even though they might have not gotten the best of the best founders to go there, they got a significant amount, and there were some little success stories here and there. And that has really helped to build out the ecosystem in a very short amount of time, just a few years. And another sort of similar example is Helsinki, that probably a lot of you might know, where essentially Christo and with Altus, at the beginning of a one-man show, really sort of built an ecosystem from scratch that was non-existent before. And what this shows is that many times it's not about the amount of money, but it's about the conviction of one person, of a small group of people that actually make an ecosystem go. And many times it's about building, the local community, connecting the local community to a global community, helping the talent to meet each other, to start companies together, to find people that they can hire, etc. And then things start running very quickly. All right, so so one of the things that I've done, and this is not perfect here, but I just asked a bunch of people, what are the pain points in Krakow? And I'm sure many of you know this better than I do, but I'm going to still go through them quickly, because of course those are some points that I've seen in a lot of other ecosystems as well. So Krakow is not the only place where you see those kind of pain points. one of the things a lot of people complain about is sort of this missing pay it forward culture that is something that is very present in the valley, where people help each other out very quickly. They cooperate, they work together. Sort of, the reason why a lot of the speakers here or myself are here is because we love to sort of give back to the community and to share our insights. And that is something that in most young ecosystems is not quite there yet. But that is really sort of a new reality to the way of how specifically those type of the ecosystem around those companies work. And so it will naturally sort of emerge that kind of behavior because it's just the way of how you can effectively build startups. It's somewhat inspired, I guess, by the open source culture and a lot of the sort of this internet culture that has evolved. Then you have little support infrastructure. It's difficult to raise money beyond the seed round. There's difficulties with co-investment, where it's very difficult for different, or it's impossible for VC firms that have been backed by the government to co-invest, which sounds really weird, of course, because it seems like it's an unnecessary hurdle. I remember I had someone from Barcelona tell me about this new model of co-investment, and I thought, this guy's stupid, because this seemed like something very obvious, but he was very adamant and said, this is such an amazing new concept, and it makes such a big difference. So this is actually something that is not a problem just here, it's a problem in a lot of smaller ecosystems that for some reason investors don't want to invest together or can't invest together in this case here, which really is a downside because it doesn't allow investors to sort of diversify their portfolio effectively. Because it's, at the end of the day, it's better for investors to have multiple people on board and to mitigate their own risk by having other people invest as well. Then, sort of one of the biggest points that, of course, came up over and over again is one of going global, an ability to pitch, where it seems like a lot of people here still have kind of difficulty with explaining what they're doing, kind of getting the value proposition across, speaking English properly, being able to sort of get the company on a global scale and being covered in the next web instead of the local press. So there is that is something that will probably that you'll get through in the next few years. And my time is running out, so I'm going to jump forward quickly, and I'm going to give a few quick examples. Because I've talked a lot about sort of different ecosystems, and we looked at the ranking. We saw that there's some ecosystems that are better than others, but really what it comes down to that it's not an either or, but you as an entrepreneur can leverage all of these different ecosystems as you need them, because all of them have upsides and downsides. Where in the valley you have a lot of capital available, the prices or the salaries for engineers are very, very high, significant cost. So it's actually very beneficial to maybe have an office in Krakow and to have another office in the valley. And there's a lot of companies, and this has really become a reality where you can see that most companies today, to some degree or another, really leverage different ecosystems. SoundCloud is one example. They started off with the idea in Stockholm. They moved to Berlin, which was kind of the perfect place for them, since they were sort of the capital of electronic music, DJs, and they sort of had their early testers. They could sort of get the product ready, but it was because it was the center of electronic music globally. It was a starting entry point for them to expand into a global market from day one. And as they started growing, they started to raise money in London and then in the US. Now they have an office in San Francisco and are very active globally. Still have most of their engineering team in in Berlin though. Ostrovok is another company. It's founded by, taking 2 more minutes, okay? Yeah. Is another company founded by a guy who started companies in the UK and in the US, and now started the company in Moscow, but raised money from the Valley, so leveraged his network in Silicon Valley, but built a company that actually right now focused on the Russian market. Citus Data is a very, very small company, but sort of one of those classic examples where you sort of have this coexistence between 2 places. They have part of the team in Istanbul, do all of the engineering there, and then the rest is in the Valley where they do the fundraising and where all of their customers, most of their customers sit. Lemon is another example. It's also started by some guys from Brazil, and they started a few companies before this in the Valley, raised the money there, but again built out some part of the team, hired a lot of people from Latin America, and then built out teams in Brazil and Argentina, and leveraged sort of the advantages of the availability of talent in those places, and the availability of talent, of money in the Valley. And then, sort of going back to a lot of those investors that I mentioned earlier, many of them start to think global, many of them start to see opportunities around the world, more the VC firms than angel investors, but that's generally the trend. And you as a Polish company can still raise money from those funds if you start to connect into the right networks. All right, now maybe we can do a few more questions. Yeah, all right.
Any questions?
I can go first. It's a really great presentation because you gave a lot of data on different ecosystems. The question that I have is that one of the things that make Silicon Valley unique is the distribution of equity and wealth among not just the few founders of companies, but also the employees. Even not the only early employees, but also the employees that joined further on. My question is, have you seen anywhere except Silicon Valley and maybe New York in the world that this actually happens? Because in Poland and in Europe, I don't think that's the case. So basically, if there's an exit, a successful one, just a couple of people get rich and they don't really, contribute to the ecosystem and make it grow. So what's your perspective on that in terms of the data that you have?
Yeah, so this is absolutely true, and I've seen also examples of friends of mine where, I think in Russia, for example, they love to start companies that have like 3 different mother companies in like Brussels and Singapore and BVI and so on, and they give their employees sometimes equity in the Russian company, and in the end of the day, they maximize, of course, for their own output, their own return. That is, this is somewhat something that just happens as an ecosystem evolves and as people get more educated, right? It has to do a lot with reference points and sort of certain norms that start to establish themselves. It also has to do with a certain mentality, right? Where you want to have teams of people that are invested into the company. And I think it's something natural that evolves. And you can see that in Silicon Valley, this is much more present in New York and Boston than
anywhere outside of the US?
I mean, so what happens really is that over the last 2 years, you have seen, because a lot of these things are really they're written down. There's tons of blog posts, and there's about this. Most people who will start to do a bit of research will see those things, right? There's lists of how much equity does a first employee usually get, right? And those lists, of course, get shared, and people know about this. So it is something where we can actually see a very fast adoption of those principles globally. And so it's just really a matter of time that this will become, there will be differences, of course, but that it becomes more normal to have, to share like more equity with various people, right? And that, investors won't have 50% of your company, but they have 10%, and the founders will keep the majority, and then there will be good stake for employees. That is something that, you know, one reason also why you didn't really why you don't have this as much in a lot of smaller ecosystems is because investors don't have a reference point of a Google or a Facebook, right? So for them, the returns are very different. The expected returns are very different. So they need to take it, or based on that logic, they need to take a different equity stake, right? And so the assumption of that you build the next, like, Facebook or Google, of course, would imply that you have a different equity structure, and that is something, you know, where it's a lot about education, about transparency, and people sort of talking about this, and more companies go global. Yeah.
One last question. In terms of the size of the local market, right? Poland is a market of 40 million people. Probably half of them, or maybe a little bit more than half, have internet connections, so they're active internet users. Have you seen anywhere a thriving local startup ecosystem that doesn't actually produce global companies, but is still viable?
It's still what?
Viable. So there's still exits of the local market. It's not really connected with the global economy. It's just local, but it's big enough that it can sustain itself.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
the US, of
you
course,
see this in China, and you see this in like Russia, right? I mean, Russia has had a number of success stories just because the sort of Russian-speaking hemisphere is like pretty large, right? So you have like Yandex, which is still dominating the Russian-speaking like search engine market. So yeah, I mean, there are some examples. In Germany, you've seen a number of companies. Like if the market is big enough, in France, you've seen some companies.
And do you have any empirical data of how, when the market is big enough? Is there something that you've observed?
I'm sure there's something that you could say, but this depends very much on what kind of company you're building, right? For some companies, it might be big enough, for others not. I mean, it depends. Yeah.
Okay, just to you will have the last question. Remember, you will still have the ability to catch Bjoern during the rest of the conference and during the evening after party. Peter, last question from you.
Okay, I would like to ask about the mindset. In Silicon Valley, the holy grail is to build $1 billion company. What would be the advice for Polish entrepreneurs? The same, build $1 billion company, or something else?
$2 billion.
Well, if you go to Founders Fund, they would say $1 billion. There's no $1 billion companies. We only go for $10 billion companies. Yeah, but generally, in the end of the day, it's about like your personal choice, right? It's like there's what happens a bit too much sometimes, and I think that's something that some people here mentioned too for Poland, is that they kind of see startups as something cool, and let's do a startup, and startups should go for $1 billion market, so let's also do this. I think in the end of the day, you need to know what you want to personally achieve in your life, what kind of impact you want to create, and if you're willing to put the work into something that can turn into $1 billion company, right? It's something where you might go through a lot of ups and downs, and where it might be not easy to actually become a successful company. Whereas if you do something that is lower risk, where you will make money faster, maybe that is also like a fine choice, right? It's really like it's up to everyone individually, I think, to make this choice. Yeah. I think he was waiting for like a long time.
Yes, no, sorry, but we don't have time. We want to keep the schedule. Thank you, Bjoern, for your lecture about ecosystem. I hope that we now have a wider view on the ecosystem. And even though we are going up and down, we have failures. Finally, we will manage to do a $1 billion company.